Welcome, Stephanie Rayburn. She is a current doctoral student at CSU in applied developmental science and a marriage and family therapist. She has been involved in facilitating mindfulness programs for several years now and has most recently been facilitating mindfulness classes for residents of Columbine Health Systems through a partnership with the CSU Department of Human Development and Family Studies. Stephanie's favorite mindful moments usually involve nature, and she spends a lot of her free time in the garden during the summer months. Thank you, Stephanie, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Allie. Let's see. So I can't see all of you, but I do see a lot of familiar faces or familiar names popping up, and also several new names. I'm glad that you all could come and learn a little bit more about mindfulness and how it can help support our healthy development in adulthood throughout our lifespan. As Allie mentioned, I have been facilitating mindfulness practices through Columbine Health Systems. And that partnership really is something that developed out of an expressed interest in the community, an interest in the facilities for more comprehensive mindfulness to be available. So that project initially started with mindfulness classes for staff, and has since moved forward with also offering mindfulness classes for the residents, which is the part of that project that I'm involved with. But I also have facilitated mindfulness classes for teens and for pregnant and birthing families, and engaging in my own practice as well. So I am hoping there may be some opportunity for some dialogue at the end here, but I'd like to just begin with giving you an opportunity to have your own experience of what mindfulness is. I recognize that there may be a lot of different levels of knowledge and experience with mindfulness, and I'll explain more about what mindfulness is, but I think it can be really helpful just to experience it for yourself first. So we're just going to take 30 seconds or so here. I invite you just to sit. I'm going to be quiet. I invite you just to sit, and you don't have to do anything in particular. Just as if you were sitting, waiting for the next thing to happen, which you're doing. So let's just try being still and quiet for a moment and just see what happens. Okay, so now you might just make a little inventory of any of the sounds that you maybe heard while you were sitting quietly. And I didn't really ask you to pay attention to sounds specifically, so if there aren't many, that's okay. All right, so now I'd like you to try this exercise again, but this time I invite you to really consciously pay attention to any sounds that you notice in your environment, from small sounds to loud sounds, maybe repeating sounds, or just once sounds that pop up out of nowhere. And maybe the quality of those sounds, whether it's a natural kind of sound or a mechanical sound. So just taking a few seconds here and making an inventory of any of the sounds that you hear in your environment. Okay. Now I invite you to consider the difference in what you noticed, what you experienced between the first time when we were just sitting, not doing anything in particular, and the second time when we were sitting and intentionally noticing the sounds that were around you. So for most people, that second time, they tend to notice many more things. Our brains actually get very good at dismissing extra things in our environment. That helps us focus on whatever it is that we're trying to attend to. But if we're not attending to anything in particular, we might actually just kind of zone out, or our minds might wander. That can be good sometimes. It can also be really distracting sometimes. That can sometimes happen when we don't really want it to. So this little exercise hopefully gave you a taste of the difference between mindful attention, where you are paying attention on purpose to a particular thing in your environment, or our kind of typical distracted attention, where we notice some things and disregard others. So when we think about what mindfulness is, I'm going to take a moment here and share my screen for anybody who is on, who can see the video. When we think about what mindfulness is, this present moment, attending to what's going on, can help us to really focus our attention and become very curious about what is in our environment. That quality of curiosity, it tends to calm us down a little, slow us down a little, and allow us to really become open and attentive to noticing things that we might otherwise disregard or not even recognize at all. So this mindful listening practice that we just did, for example, whenever I do this, I tend to notice things in my environment that I usually don't even think about, like the sound of the refrigerator running or sounds outside. And that can really help to open our awareness to our present moment experience. Another quality of mindfulness that you may or may not have noticed with this practice is a quality of acceptance and non-judgment. So when we're practicing mindfulness, we may notice judgments come up, like, oh, that's a really annoying sound that I'm hearing. But that approach of curiosity can really help us to set aside our judgments and just notice what's happening in our environment. So that quality of non-judgment, acceptance of whatever is happening in the present moment, that's the experience of mindfulness. We're just focused, attentive, and aware. And we can apply this in our lives in a lot of different ways. We can be aware of what's happening in our own bodies, our physical sensations, or the sensation of the world around us, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're tasting. We can also be aware of our own thought processes. So we often develop kind of habitual thought patterns, responses to things that are in our environment or memories. We also can just find ourselves with our minds wandering and maybe not remember how we started thinking about that subject or how we got distracted from what it was that we meant to be doing or thinking about. So mindfulness helps us to notice what our thoughts are doing. And we can actually use this practice to help us become more attentive and aware of our thought processes so that we can gain a little bit more control over them, in the sense that we can not necessarily control the content of our thoughts, but we can choose how to respond to our thoughts. So we don't need to follow every thought that we have all the way down the rabbit hole. Mindfulness can also help us to be aware of our emotions, whatever feelings are coming up. Often that can occur in response to our thought processes. Those two things are frequently tied together. And it can help us to respond in more intentional ways to our emotions. So it can help us to be slightly less reactive and to respond maybe more calmly or more rationally in intense situations. It can also help us to direct compassion towards ourselves and towards others when we recognize how we are feeling and what other people might be feeling. So all of these are part of this practice of mindfulness. And that sounds like a lot, maybe, but the practice itself is very simple, like you just experienced. And there are a lot of different ways that we can practice this. So one of the ways that mindfulness can be really helpful for us is to reduce our stress. We all typically have experiences of feeling overwhelmed. Maybe things just are starting to build up. We might become stressed by one thing, and then before we can even really address that thing, something else has happened, and then something else has happened. And before we know it, we might be feeling totally overwhelmed or even burned out if that has been happening for a long time. This practice of mindfulness, even these small ways, like just stopping and listening to the sounds in our environment, can actually help us to regulate our stress response. Regularly practicing mindfulness has been found to reduce the amount of cortisol that people have in their bodies, the stress hormone. It also can help us to regulate our emotional responses, so that our brain, when we're experiencing something high stress, frequently our response to that happens in a part of our brain called the amygdala. And that is part of our fight or flight response. So we might be really reactive to whatever the stressor is. And practicing mindfulness can help us to calm down that part of the brain and re-engage the part of our brain that helps us to be more planful, that helps us to make decisions and respond in more intentional ways to the stressors we might be experiencing. So when we allow ourselves mindful pauses when we're feeling stress, it can help us to move forward in a way that allows us to cope in more healthy ways. So rather than, say, distracting ourselves from what we're feeling stressed by, like eating junk food, or, getting kind of lost in television or social media. We might instead respond by addressing the problem that we're experiencing, calling a friend, getting support, or just taking some time to check in with ourselves and see what it is that we need in the moment. So mindfulness gives us a little pause that helps us to move forward in ways that may be more supportive of our well-being. So I'd like us to just try this another way. There are some mindfulness practices that really directly impact the way our brains are working. And there's a very simple one that we can try right now. So I invite you just to begin by bringing your attention to your own breathing. Just noticing how your breath feels in your body, where you notice it. Maybe you feel it in your belly or your chest, in your nostrils or the back of your throat. Getting a little curious about how deep or shallow your breathing is. There's no right or wrong way to be breathing, just noticing how your body is breathing. So our breath is something that's always with us. No matter what we're doing, what's happening in the moment, the breath is always right there, and it's something that is happening right now. A way that you can focus in on this moment. And now I invite you to shift your breathing just slightly. We can always notice our body's own natural breath rhythm, but we can also choose to breathe a little differently. And both of those are ways of practicing mindfulness. So as you take these next breaths, I invite you to lengthen your out breath and try to make your out breath about twice as long as your in breath. Just notice how that feels in your body as you do that. As you're doing this, you may also notice other thoughts come up, questions, reminders, memories. If you notice that happening, just acknowledge it and let that thought pass on by and bring your attention back to your next breath. Okay, I invite you to come out of that way of breathing and return to your normal breath. If you've had your eyes closed, allowing yourself to reorient to the space that you're in. And just notice any difference in how your body feels right now. When we make those long, slow out breaths, that's actually helping to calm down our nervous system. It activates our parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system that helps us to do restful activities. Sometimes that system is called the rest and digest system. And if we do that when we're feeling stressed, it can also counter the part of our nervous system that typically responds to stressful situations, the sympathetic nervous system that regulates our fight or flight responses. So being aware of our breathing can help to calm us down. And we can actually choose to breathe a little differently, make big, long out breaths, so that we can tell our brains, it's okay, we can calm down now. That may not be appropriate in every situation, but often doing that can help to give us a little bit of space between the stressor that we're experiencing and the way that we feel we need to respond to that stressor. So even this simple practice, and I call it a practice because we can't just do it one time and expect it to make a difference in our lives in a meaningful way, but incorporating that into our lives in small ways throughout the day can really start to impact the way we experience stress, how we respond to stress, and how that stress impacts our bodies. I also want to talk about some other ways that mindfulness supports our well-being. Regular mindfulness practice has been shown to be associated with lower blood pressure and improved overall heart health, including a lower resting heart rate. Mindfulness is also associated with improved cognitive health, improving things such as memory, our ability to focus our attention on a particular task, and our ability to regulate our emotions so that when we are feeling emotional, it isn't completely overwhelming us every time. Mindfulness has also been associated with improved immune function. So parts of the immune system tend to perform better within people who practice mindfulness regularly. And there's also some interesting research coming out showing that mindfulness may have an impact on cell aging, actually reducing extending the length of our cell life. Mindfulness also has benefits for our emotional well-being. So mindfulness is a common and beneficial intervention for people who suffer with symptoms of depression and anxiety. And mindful awareness can also help to increase our ability to notice and attend to experiences of joy that we have and our feelings of gratitude. And that can really help to make people happier. Our brains are actually wired to attend to scary situations, things that are stressful or upsetting or potentially dangerous. And it's important that our brains do that. That helps us and has helped us throughout history to be aware of things that that are important to our ability to keep living, right? Our well-being. But we don't necessarily have the same wiring to really hone in on something that is happy or uplifting. There may be moments like that. For example, if you think about the last time you really had an experience of awe that experience of awe where something is so positive, it's almost overwhelming. We, we may have those experiences, but our everyday lives, the tendency for most people is to spend more time thinking about the things that could go wrong or are going wrong, the things that are hard or are not serving us well, than we do spending, than we do thinking about things that are going well in our lives or moments of joy or contentment. So mindfulness practice can help us to really sink into those joyful experiences as well. So that if we notice ourselves feeling joyful, we might really sink into that experience, become mindful of the feeling of joy in our bodies, what our face is doing, what our thoughts or feelings are doing in response to a joyful moment, and trying to stay with that for a little longer. As we do that, by expressing gratitude, noticing those moments of joy, that can train our minds to be more attentive overall to happy moments and experiences of happiness in our lives. It can increase our ability to experience and notice happy things. Mindfulness can also help us become aware of our habitual responses to things. We all typically have kind of cycles of negative thoughts that we might get into. And maybe for some of us, those have been thoughts that we've had since childhood, or for years, that have influenced our lives, little stories we tell ourselves, or rules maybe that we have for ourselves. And when things maybe seem to not be going well, or we've made a mistake, we might find ourselves habitually thinking these thoughts. We also can have habitual unhealthy coping patterns. As I mentioned before, when we're dealing with stress, we might resort to ways of coping that are not good for our bodies, like smoking or drinking, or kind of numbing ourselves to our environment by seeking other stimulating experiences. Mindfulness can also improve our ability to choose alternative coping strategies. So when we first become aware of our habits, the ways that we respond that might not be helpful or healthy for us, that also gives us a little space to do something different. So the practice then can become little by little, giving ourselves the opportunity to choose another way of coping. Mindfulness itself can be a healthy way of coping, but it can also help us to stop the unhealthy or habitual coping responses that we've had in the past and choose a different thing to try. As I mentioned at the beginning, also, self-compassion is part of mindfulness. It goes in hand with the non-judgment piece of mindfulness. And that practice of mindfulness can help us to really give ourselves grace when we make a mistake, when we notice ourselves later, maybe having engaged in some coping that isn't really helping us, or that maybe we got caught up in an emotional response and feel regret later. Our ability to really notice what's happening with that non-judgment, that stance of accepting what's happening, accepting that we are all human. We are not machines who are going to respond perfectly in every situation. That can help us to extend compassion to ourselves for not doing what we wish we had done. It can also help us to reduce the amount of criticism that we leverage against ourselves and notice self-critical thoughts as they come up without needing to build them up in our minds. For example, if somebody has a self-critical thought like, oh, that was so stupid, I can't believe I just did that. Mindfulness in that moment could help a person to recognize that thought and then just to let it go by. Thoughts they're just another kind of energy in our body, and we can let them come and go. They don't all need to be responded to in the moment. So being aware of what our thoughts are doing, what our brain is doing, can help us just to release and let things go. That not all thoughts are true thoughts, and not all thoughts need to be attended to or addressed in the moment. Another aspect of mindfulness that can be particularly helpful through the process of aging is that piece of acceptance. Mindfulness can help us to become aware of things that we might want to change or do differently, but it also really fundamentally is rooted in a place of accepting what is. And there are parts of aging that just are. They're part of the experience, and they can be different for different people. So practicing mindfulness can help us to accept the limits of our body, and it also extend our ability to be at peace with our abilities and where we're at in the aging process. We may make choices to support our body's well-being, and the body will still age. So accepting what the body is, what it feels, what the abilities are of our bodies, knowing our own limits, that is all part of the practice of really embodying mindfulness. And in a little bit, I'll lead us through another brief mindfulness practice that is really centered around this idea of noticing the body, accepting the body. So lastly, in just considering how mindfulness can be helpful in our lives, is the idea of improving our relationships. We have habitual responses to people we are in relationship with, just like we have habitual responses to our own thoughts, our own stressors. And mindfulness can help us to really pause and notice the person that we're relating to, whether that's our spouse or a child or an adult child, a sibling or parents. That pause to consider what we are thinking and feeling in relationship to that other person, and also considering what the other person may be thinking or feeling or hoping for when we're communicating with somebody, can really help us to deepen our understanding and improve our communication with the people that we are relating to. So one way that might look in practice is to incorporate the practice of mindful listening when talking with somebody. And that may not be every conversation that you have, but trying it out, just seeing what it feels like to only listen to somebody, not be formulating a response or thinking about what that person should do to solve whatever problem they might be having. Commonly we might be listening to somebody kind of with one ear, but then also thinking about what we are going to say next, what else we want to contribute to the conversation. And that really inhibits our ability to notice what the other person is saying. So you might practice this. In fact, I invite you to try this out with somebody in your life later today, tomorrow, this weekend. having a conversation with them where you spend some time just listening. And then instead of trying to solve a problem, if that's what they're telling you, instead of offering advice or contributing your own experience to the conversation, try just reflecting back what they experience, what you heard them share in that conversation. So, they may tell you a long story about something that's happening in their life, or it might be brief. See if you can just listen as well as you can, and then try to sum it up, and include some acknowledgement of how that feels for them, building that empathy piece, and then reply back to them like, wow, it sounds like, or wow, I heard you saying that, and just reflect back what they told you. See how that's different from our normal way of communicating. We can also incorporate the same kind of mindfulness habits when we're speaking. So taking a brief moment to pause and check in with our own thoughts and feelings before we respond to somebody. And that can be really helpful in moments of tension or conflict, especially. So, people who are in long relationships with each other, no matter what kind of family relationship, they learn really well how to kind of push each other's buttons, or maybe the signs that a conflict is brewing, like a certain quirk of the eyebrow, or a crease in the mouth, or tone in their voice. And we actually can become very responsive, kind of reactive to those little cues, in ways that increase our likelihood of being in conflict with that person. We might start to feel angry at them before we even have understood why. And practicing a mindful pause to just acknowledge what we're thinking, what we're feeling before we start to speak, again, it gives us that opportunity to be a little bit more intentional about how we're responding to the situation. We can use our own words as a gift to the people in our lives, or we may use our own words as a curse to the people in our lives. And mindfulness can help us to be more likely to say what we mean and express ourselves in ways that are more likely to be understood. And lastly, mindfulness in our relationships can help us to develop healthy emotional boundaries with the people in our lives. So that, for example, if somebody we know is experiencing a crisis, or they're feeling very emotional, telling us something, often we feel that emotion mirrored in ourselves. And we might respond in that same kind of emotional way. And mindfulness can help us to create a little space there as well. So we can separate our own response just a little bit from the person who we're relating to, or listening to. It can also help us to be aware of interactions that we may have with people in our families that don't feel particularly good. Sometimes we may have, families can develop patterns, dynamics that aren't really healthy, but it's been so common throughout our lives that you may not be aware really of that doesn't feel good in your body, or that brings up kind of difficult emotions if there's a certain interaction pattern that's happening with a friend, a loved one, a relative. So as we become aware of those things, being more attuned to our own thoughts, our own feelings, it can help us to separate ourselves from unhealthy patterns as well, so that we aren't also contributing to cycles of unhealthy emotional patterns with the people that we are interacting with. So these are things that take practice and time and can be very beneficial in our lives, but we don't have to, there's not like a amount of practice that we have to get to before we start seeing benefits of mindfulness. We can start practicing mindfulness right now. We can practice it later today, maybe. So one of my favorite ways to practice mindfulness is when I'm brushing my teeth, because I don't like brushing my teeth, really. It's kind of a boring activity. And my mind tends to wander. So that's a great opportunity for me to try to just be really present instead of letting my thoughts wander. We have these opportunities all the time in multiple ways throughout our day. We don't need to be mindful all the time. And in fact, we won't be mindful all the time. But we can begin to intentionally focus on what's happening in the present moment in many different ways. There are a lot of ways that we can practice this. So I'm putting up a list here of some of the ways that people practice mindfulness. There are formal meditation practices, and in fact, that practice that we did, noticing our breathing, that is a common form of a formal meditation practice, excuse me. And those are practices that you can do on your own. Many people who are beginning and people who have been doing mindfulness for years find that having guided practices is helpful. It can help us to come back to the practice more often. At first, we tend to get kind of caught by our thoughts regularly. And it might take us a while before we realize that we have been thinking about something else and just kind of followed a thought, and to come back to the practice. So a guided practice can help you to recognize when you've gotten distracted a little quicker and bring your attention back to whatever it is that you're focusing on. There are a lot of different practices available now, and many of them are available for free. There are a lot of mindfulness practices available online. You can easily find them on YouTube for free. You can access mindfulness CDs. There are mindfulness practice groups that you may be able to find in your community. And there are also a variety of apps available now that you can put on your smartphone or a tablet that have often hundreds of different practices that you can do. And I have some listed here: Calm, Insight Timer, Headspace. Many of those have some free practices and additional practices that you could pay to access. But we don't have to only practice mindfulness in this way of sitting meditation. We can also become mindful, and in fact, you may find yourself experiencing mindfulness almost on accident when you're doing some of these things. So exercise is a way that we can be mindful. We can notice the feeling of movement in our bodies. Talking to people who are runners. I'm not really a runner myself, although I have, but I don't like it, which maybe makes it a good mindfulness practice for me. You know, there's that mental game of keep running. Oh, but I really want to stop, but I'm going to keep going. So that is a mindfulness practice, kind of noticing the back and forth that we do in our own thoughts, the bargains that we make with ourselves. Let me get to the next corner, or I'll do this next set of exercises. If I can just make it that far, then I'll reassess. Maybe I'll decide to stop there. So we can be aware of our movements, what's happening in our minds, our emotions when we're exercising. And exercise also has the benefit of increasing our endorphins and helping us to feel better and happier in our bodies as well. There are some exercises that are designed around mindfulness. So yoga is one, Tai Chi is another, Qigong. Those exercise practices are incorporating mindfulness into the practice, but you can incorporate mindfulness into any kind of exercise that you do. Another way to practice mindfulness is through creative arts, expressing yourself through journaling, crafting, coloring. That's a really popular one right now. Making music. You can also experience mindfulness in appreciating the art making of another person. So listening to music, or seeing a play, or looking at the art that other people have created. You may feel very present when you're appreciating art. Mindfulness is also part of many religious practices. And so when I talk about mindfulness, I'm not talking about mindfulness as it exists only in Buddhist or Zen Buddhist practices. Actually, the experience of mindfulness is something that is part of many spiritual and religious practices, part of prayer, part of singing hymns. So we have a lot of ways within our spiritual or religious beliefs that help us to achieve that same level of presence and calm that's part of mindfulness. We can also experience mindfulness when we are in dialogue with another person, deeply listening to them, communicating with them. And we can also have mindful experiences when we're doing community work, when we are intentionally and actively doing work to serve others. That can create moments of mindfulness and also help us to bring intention into what we're doing. That is characteristic of mindfulness. So that might look like volunteering or activism, or maybe it's part of the work that we do on a daily basis. Maybe caring for somebody in your family, or helping a neighbor, those sorts of things. Right, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and we have, I see about 10 minutes left. So I want to leave a little time for questions. I've just talked at you for a lot, so I invite you to take a moment, and we're just going to do a very brief body scan, which is another formal mindfulness practice. These can be very long, but they can also be relatively quick. So we'll do a short one here. So I invite you just to really settle into whatever space you're in, maybe shift to be a little more comfortable if you need to, and begin bringing your awareness to your breath first, noticing your breathing. And now I invite you to put your attention on your toes and your feet, or your legs, just starting towards the bottom of your body and beginning to work your way up, really noticing each part of your body. Noticing how that part of your body feels inside and outside. You might notice feelings of discomfort in some parts of your body. And just as much as you can, accepting whatever that feeling is, or shifting if that will help to ease the discomfort. And breathing into each part of your body as you go. So bringing your awareness up your legs, into your hips, into your belly, your back, your chest, your fingers and hands and arms. Moving up to your head. Noticing each part of your face. Your chin and lips, the nose, your eyes, your forehead, all the way up to the top of your head. And then taking a deep, full breath to fill your body with oxygen as you breathe in and out for a few breaths. Accepting your body, allowing it however it is in this moment. And now reorienting your attention back into your space, in this space. Just taking your time. All right. If anybody has any questions, I would be happy to respond to them as best I can.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. We did get one question in the chat so far. So do the physiological benefits of mindfulness occur similarly among gender, age, and people living with chronic health issues?
That is a really good question that I don't have the answer to off the top of my head, but I would be happy to look into it more. And if there's a way to send out some information as I find it, I would be glad to do that.
Yeah, I could certainly send that out with the video since we're recording.
Okay.
Anybody else have anything they'd like to ask Stephanie? As a beginner, what would be a minimum amount of time you would spend a day to note the benefits?
Yes, so that's a very personal personal thing. Really, in practicing mindfulness, you are likely to start noticing the benefit of that right away. As to beginning to have more long-term benefits, it's something that you would want to try to make a daily practice as much as possible. So that might look like maybe spending a little time in formal mindfulness practice, if possible. When I started practicing mindfulness, I had young children. So sitting to practice mindfulness for 15 minutes was not a thing that was going to happen for me. So I found other ways to incorporate it into my life, like brushing my teeth, for example. But really, as often as you are thinking of it, maybe you step outside and try having a mindful walk where you're walking in your neighborhood or just going and sitting outside for a period of time and really noticing everything that's in your environment, the sounds, the temperature of the air, the breeze. So rather than there being a minimum amount of time, I would recommend trying to have there be multiple times in your day that you're practicing mindfulness. So maybe you try to do something in the morning and again at lunch and again in the afternoon. Maybe you practice shortly before you're going to bed. And those can be brief practices, but you also could really benefit and achieve more of those benefits more quickly with some longer practices rather than only using brief practices.
Great. And is there a particular mindfulness app that you like the most?
That's a good question. I think it's a very personal decision. My favorite is the Calm app because they have such a variety of practices. And there are what they call sleep stories in there that are people with soothing voices, usually very famous people, many of them, who are reading stories, but in a way that is very soothing and relaxing. So I enjoy that part of that app. Insight Timer has a lot of practices that are free, and there are ways that you can kind of track your progress with that. Um, so since most apps have some free content, I recommend maybe just getting a couple and trying them out to see what you like. You know, maybe one app has a person's has a facilitator for the practices whose voice you don't really like, and another one has practices with somebody whose voice you do like more, those kinds of things. Just try them out and see what fits for you.
Right. And are there better or worse or more challenging times of the day to try to develop the habit, such as not when you're angry or hungry?
Yeah. I think it is easier to start developing the habit in kind of low intensity situations, right? But actually, the more you can try to practice in higher intensity situations, the quicker that you will, it will become easier for you to navigate those high intensity situations. So I do think, you know, it may not be the best idea to only start trying to do mindfulness when you're upset. You might not get very far and it might feel like that's not helping. So yes, please start with some kind of simple, low intensity situations where, you know, there's not a lot going on and you can just get used to the feeling of mindfulness. But bringing that into higher stress moments, trying to remember to bring that in, will you'll find that you're able to respond in more helpful ways as you're practicing that.
Right. One more quick one. Is mindfulness beneficial for individuals who may have thought disorders such as schizophrenia or psychosis?
So I will say that I don't have a lot of knowledge about how research in that area. That being said, my I expect that it would be helpful. That's something that I would be happy to look into more. Since mindfulness has this ability to give us a little distance from our thoughts, I expect that there could be some benefit for all individuals, including individuals who are experiencing really difficult thought patterns and confusing thought patterns, to help them to maybe change how they're responding to their thoughts a little, or have some space from associating their identities so completely with the thoughts that they're having.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Um, if anyone has any further questions, I just dropped my email into the chat. So feel free to email me. We'll be having another speaker series next month with everything is, all the details will be determined. So if you're interested in that, please send me an email and I'll make sure you're on our mailing list. Thank you so much. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thank you.